The corporate state. There's a price we pay for the corporate state. And it's not just about wages and jobs and leisure hours. The price we're paying for living in a state we've turned over to corporations to run is being paid literally in our lives. You said, we're going to sacrifice zones. A, what does that mean, and why sacrifice zones?
These were the pockets of the country that were sacrificed first. I mean, West Virginia, the coal fields of West Virginia is probably the best example. Here you have the extraction of a natural resource by large corporations. These corporations are not based in West Virginia. The utter degradation, I mean destruction, poisoning of the environment, impoverishment of those communities. Now with mountaintop removal, the obliteration, literally, of the Appalachian Mountains. And these people in this land have been sacrificed so that we in New York can leave lights on in office towers all night and parking, use parking garage lots, and that they went first. But as Karl Marx understood, unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force. It has no self-imposed limits, and so in business terms, these pockets that in essence they've harvested and destroyed are left behind, and then they move on to the rest of us, and we have to look very closely at these areas that went first to see what happens when you force human communities, families, ecosystems to kneel before the dictates of the marketplace, which of course is the fundamental ideology that has gripped the late stage of the American empire. It's just absurdity, but that's it. Because all of these places are invisible. And one of the fundamental points of this book was to make these people in these communities visible. We never see them. It's the tawdry, salacious celebrity gossip. The few times we ever see poor people on television is when they are ridiculed and laughed at, whether that's Jerry Springer or Jersey Shore, sort of low rent, white. But we don't see the struggle, for dignity and self-respect, for economic survival that has gripped perhaps now a third of the country. These people have been banished from our consciousness. And you get a sense of the trajectory of where we began, what happened, where we went, and where we are now. Norcross is a perfect example of how an oligarchic, largely white power structure works. He has amassed, or he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You can't get a job, you can't get an elected office in Camden unless you are a Norcross-approved candidate or worker. Because he essentially is the political boss of southern New Jersey, controls what reconstruction monies were designated for Camden, and he used them for his pet projects, in particular his medical center, Cooper Hospital. And then, of course, these become huge employers for construction firms and public relations firms. And as the Philadelphia Inquirer has documented, these firms then give back to the Norcross machine to keep it running. And that's a microcosm. That's just writ large throughout the country. Because on a national level, it is utterly impossible for an American citizen to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. That's what living in a corporate state means.
Explain what you mean by that.
It means that we have devolved into what Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. It's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to be loyal to the Constitution and electoral politics and the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally have seized all levers of power. So the Supreme Court is just a wholly owned corporate subsidiary. Our legislative branch passes pieces of legislation that are written by corporate lobbyists. And if anyone so much as whispers against corporate interests or fails to pay them enough deference, they destroy them. But every elected official knows that once they're in office, if they dare to challenge, even in an incredibly minor way, what corporations want, they're finished. Well, the only way to fight back is to build movements. and institutions. And if there's a kind of theme, certainly in the West Virginia chapter, it is the rise of the United Mine Workers Union, which made a tremendous difference in the lives, health, empowerment of coal miners, and its rise and subsequent destruction. And that really is the fundamental lesson of American history. We were never set up as a popular democracy. All of the openings within the democratic process were fought for bitterly and often lethally between movements and those in power, whether that was the suffragists or the labor movement or the Liberty Party that fought slavery or the civil rights movement. If we don't rebuild those movements, then we are going to be rapidly, we already are very far gone, being rapidly reconfigured into a kind of neo-feudalistic state with a rapacious corporate oligarchic class that uses increasingly harsh and draconian forms of control, the iron heel, to keep us in place.
Maybe this country's just not fit for the sort of democracy that we need to get out of this mess. Maybe this is its destiny.
Well, it's more the destiny. I mean, the disease is not so much the system, which was a system that really locked, the disempowered out quite consciously, whether it was Native Americans, African Americans, women, people without property. I mean, there's a long list. And let's remember, George Washington, by the time he was president, was the wealthiest person in the country, not only because of his large slaveholding plantation, but because he was a huge land speculator and bought up all sorts of lands west of the Mississippi. But I think it's empire. I think it's the disease of empire. And we're following a very familiar trajectory of dying empires, where you expand beyond your capacity to sustain empire and yourself. Whether it's the Roman Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, that you have rapacious, immoral elites who retreat into their version of Versailles or the Forbidden City, and they end up consuming their own. I mean, one of the engines of the French Revolution was when Louis XVI started revoking the patents of the nobility and reselling them. They eat their own in the same way that CEOs, in order for personal enrichment, are often quite willing to take down their own companies and, of course, defraud their shareholders. And when you reach that point, it's a kind of terminal point.
So they decline, they eat their own. What do the rest of us do? I mean, are we yet beyond the point where we can, as some have written, reclaim our own measure of a man, dream our own dreams, reclaim our sense of identity, of humanity, given that we've let so many be sacrificed?
Well, this is why we're going to have to radically reconfigure our relationship to each other and to the planet. And the corporate forces that control our systems of communication, that have degraded our universities and systems of education into vocational schools, are determined that we don't think that way. We sort of just march forward as cogs. And that's the power of Occupy, is that they did begin to ask the right questions, and however imperfectly, attempt to build structures of governance where voices that traditionally are not heard were heard, and not only were heard, but were given a kind of prominence. Can we pull ourselves from out of the brink? I don't know.
So you think there is a limit to the amount of sacrifice we'll take?
Of course, because corporations know only one word, and that's more. And they will push and push, but they have no internal limits. And they will push until there's pushback. And we see it week after week. I mean, the new agriculture bill, they whack food stamps. 47 million Americans depend on food stamps to eat. 6 million Americans, that's their exclusive source of income. And I mentioned the decision not to extend unemployment benefits for hundreds of thousands of Americans. I mean, this is insane. And eventually you're going to get a reaction. But it may not look like, people sitting around a park singing Kumbaya. And that's what worries me. That there are very, very dark forces in the United States. And essentially what you have is political paralysis. Well, they're basically the two parties are fighting over a very narrow sliver of the electorate because most of the electorate is checked out.
Finally, I want to believe that this is a rebellion in the works and that you found it wherever you went. What you actually write about, apart from a few individuals, is a state of despair.
Yeah.
High qualities of infighting, high degrees of infighting,
Right.
drug abuse,
Right.
prescription drugs. I don't see suicide, I don't see sacrifice zones in revolt in this book.
No, because these people have been destroyed. And this is a kind of flashing red light. It's a warning. Because when you sink to that level of despair, then in every chapter, every place that we write about, whether it's Immokalee, Florida, whether it's Pine Ridge, Camden, West Virginia, you go in two routes. You either go towards religiosity of some type. In Pine Ridge, of course, it's Lakota religion, sweat lodges, sun dances. Or you anesthetize yourselves with opiates. You go into some of these old coal camps, Jenkins Jones, in southern West Virginia, and those that remain. It looks like Bosnia. You drive down the street, and it's one charred embers with a spindly chimney, one after the other. It's just remarkable. And people who come out, you feel like you're interviewing, zombies. They're so pumped up on Oxycontin. And there are people in the book that we interviewed who, a few weeks later died of overdoses. In other places like Pine Ridge, it's alcohol. But it is possible to break human beings, and a lot of these people have been broken. And that's why we can't allow these forces to continue to roll forward.